What do we know about Hitler the man as opposed to Hitler the myth? Our reviewer, Adam Kirsch, will be here to talk about a new biography, Hitler, the Ascent.
Hitler was not a supernatural creature. He was a human being with some great talents and other weaknesses and things that would make him comprehensible.
Who better to read a poem by Billy Collins than Billy Collins himself?
I like a cat wearing a chapeau or a trilby, little Jack Horner sitting on a sofa.
He's here to talk about his latest collection, The Rain in Portugal.
Old men who are not from Nantucket, and how life can seem almost unreal when you are gently rowing a boat down a stream.
Can being transgender actually be an anchor for a child growing up in an otherwise unstable environment? Author, activist, and TV host Tillett Wright explores this in his new memoir, Darling Days.
Maybe the way to have a normal life is to just fit in. So I tried to live as a girl for a while, and it took me until 3 years ago at 28 to figure out that actually I think I had it right when I was a kid.
Also, literary news and what we and other people are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Adolf Hitler honed his own image with the utmost care. Before his suicide in 1945, he ordered his private papers to be burned. So trying to understand what made Hitler tick, aside from his self-created mythology, has been an ongoing challenge for historians. Adam Kirsch is here now with us to talk about a book he reviews in this week's issue, Hitler, Ascent, 1889 to 1939 by Volker Ullrich. Adam, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure.
And I will also mention that you have your own book, which we will touch on afterwards, that you've just written, or rather that has just been published, The People and the Books, a slightly different take on Jewish issues from
yes.
the book at hand. So let's talk about this Hitler book, which is already on the bestseller list. I'm not sure that always happens with a major biography of Hitler. What does this book set out to do?
I think if you wanted to characterize how this book is different from other major Hitler biographies, you'd say that it's about stripping away myth. Mm-hmm. Volker Ullrich, who is a German journalist and historian, really wants to show that Hitler was not a supernatural creature. He was a human being with some great talents and other weaknesses and things that would make him comprehensible.
Is this the first biography that's taken that approach?
I think there's been major Hitler biographies in almost every generation, and starting in the 1930s, even when he first took power, because he's a mystery. He's a phenomenon that people have always tried to understand. So roughly every 15 or 20 years, there's another new major Hitler biography, and this one tries to take a different approach in that it draws on new source material, things that have been uncovered in the last 15 to 20 years, and also the demystifying approach.
So the last major book was by Ian Kershaw.
Right.
And what was Kershaw's take?
Kershaw was talking a lot about the debate between structuralists and what you might call individualists, the idea of how much of what happened in the Third Reich was because Hitler wanted it to happen, mm-hmm. and how much was the results of society and events. That particular debate is not as salient for Ullrich, although you could say that Ullrich is much more focused on Hitler as an individual. He's trying to say what kind of person he was. He writes a lot about what he was like when he was off stage, when he was at home with friends, his early life, parts of him that we don't ordinarily see or think about.
And yet you say that the book serves as history as much as it does as biography.
Well, one of the strange things about writing about Hitler is that he tried to make himself as little of an individual as possible. He really thought that his role in life was to serve the destiny of the German people. And as a result, he was not what you would call an interesting or significant individual or personality. He didn't want to be. He wanted to serve the people. And he was most alive and most important when he was in front of a crowd.
Let's talk a little bit about Hitler the man, because as you write in your review, at the age of 30, he was basically a nobody and a failure, had never held a job, had been rejected twice from art school. Who was Hitler at 30 in 1919?
While I was reading the book, I thought, imagine you were walking in front of the Metropolitan Museum and you saw one of those artists who's selling their watercolors for $20. And then imagine that artist selling you watercolor in 20 years was the dictator of the United States. That's exactly what happened with Hitler. He was literally someone who peddled postcards in Vienna before World War I. He never had a real job before he joined the army in World War I. While he was in the army, he was in the war for the entire time, 1914 to 1918 in the German army, and he was never promoted. He was a private from beginning to end. No one who came into contact with him thought anything of him. No one was impressed by him. No one thought he was an interesting person. He was never close to anyone. He didn't have any romantic relationships. He was really sort of a cipher until 1919. And then with the upheaval in Germany after the First World War, he was recruited by the army to become a right-wing nationalist orator. And he discovered that he had this great talent for giving speeches and moving crowds. And that's how he sort of emerged onto the public stage out of complete obscurity.
Was his ideology apparent before that, privately?
One of the things that Ullrich writes about is the question of when Hitler became, for instance, an anti-Semite. The standard view of that is that it was while he lived in Vienna before World War I, which was a sort of hotbed of political anti-Semitism. And Ullrich thinks that it wasn't until later, until he moved to Munich after World War I and was drawn into these right-wing nationalist circles. But he didn't ever give any indication of having any kind of political ideology until he became this public figure. But he did always have, if we're to trust what he said later in life, he always had a sense of his own destiny. He identified with characters in Wagner operas. Mm-hmm. He thought that he was someone who was destined to do great things, even as there was no evidence of it in his actual life.
And we don't have the evidence from him because he burned his papers.
Right. One of his last orders before he committed suicide at the end of World War II was to burn all of his archive. So we don't have many surviving papers from his early life. And because he was not a public figure for so long, there were not that many people who knew him or knew him well. And those who did were understandably reluctant to talk about him while he was alive.
So what kind of research, what kind of sources did Ullrich find in the 15 years since Kershaw wrote his biography that weren't available at that time?
Well, he's drawing a lot on Nazi Party archives and diaries by some Nazi leaders. A lot of the book has to do with the 6 years, just the 6 years between 1933 and 1939, which are much better documented. And that's the part of his life where Hitler becomes sort of an actor in a historical drama. The first 30 years of his life don't take up very much of the book at all. It's after he comes to power that he becomes well documented.
We should say this is the first in an expected 2-volume series, that this takes readers just up to 1939.
Right, and then presumably the next volume will cover those last 6 years of his life, which were the years of the World War.
Okay, so he is recruited to become a right-wing orator in 1919. How does he get from there to becoming Chancellor of Germany at the age of 43?
It was an amazing story and something with few parallels in history. The only comparable thing I can think of is Napoleon, who rose from being a junior army officer to being the ruler of Europe in just a few years. Hitler's distance was maybe even greater because he was never talented in a military way. What he really did was he was the man for the moment, and the moment was a time of extreme social dislocation in Germany. He first came to prominence in Munich in Bavaria in 1919, right after there had been a communist revolution, which didn't last very long, but it lasted long enough to alienate many parts of the population. And some of the leaders of that revolution were Jews. And as a result, Hitler's brand of right-wing anti-Semitism had a natural audience in Bavaria, which is where he started out. And then over the next 14 years, he was proved himself to be a very talented politician and strategist. He was adept at eliminating rivals. From the beginning of his leadership of the Nazi Party in the early 1920s, he would not tolerate any rivals. And anytime someone threatened to become as important as him or more important, he would have them eliminated, sometimes killed. He also managed to play on the weaknesses of the Weimar Republic. Hitler first tried to take power in 1923 when he tried to launch what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, which was a revolution in the streets of Munich, which was stopped by the army and the police. And he went to jail. But when he came out of jail just a few months later, he realized that the democratic system in Germany, which had been imposed after the end of World War I, was so unpopular that he could actually use democracy against itself. And so he fought and won a number of elections, and the Nazi Party grew stronger and stronger as disaster after disaster happened to Germany, such as hyperinflation, the occupation of some of its territory after World War I by the French, and the Great Depression. Each time there was one of these staggering blows to the country, the Nazis, who seemed to have the solution to all the problems, became more popular.
Is part of Ullrich's argument that Hitler was less a sort of tool of these larger parties and was in fact a very adept politician?
Well, it's a question of who was using who. In Germany in the 1920s, early 1930s, there were other conservative and nationalist parties that were initially more popular than the Nazis, and there were people who were willing to bring Hitler into the government because they thought that they would control him, that they would have the power and he would be the figurehead. In fact, in 1932, Hitler ran for president and lost. And in the next year, he was named chancellor, which was the equivalent of prime minister, as part of a coalition. He was one of just a couple of Nazis in the government. The rest of the government were other kinds of conservatives. And there were powers behind the throne who thought that Hitler could be controlled. And within a matter of weeks, he showed that, in fact, he was the one who was controlling events.
Ullrich also characterizes him as a very gifted actor and public personality.
He was able to show different faces to different audiences. When he was lecturing in front of a working-class audience in a beer hall, he could be loud and rough and vulgar. When he was talking to high society and rich industrialists in a salon or a drawing room, he was able to be courtly and polite. He knew how to adapt himself to different environments and audiences.
All right, let's address the elephant in the room, which is some people are seeing this as a parallel to today and drawing comparisons between Hitler and Trump. Do you think that's a valid comparison?
I thought a lot about that as I was reading the book, and I think that reading Ullrich shows that Trump is not at all like Hitler as a person or a personality in terms of his biography. So I think his political ideas come from the same universe in the sense that he is an authoritarian and a nativist, and he believes in demonizing enemies and uniting people through fear, and those are all things that Hitler was adept at. The difference is that Hitler was, in some sense, a kind of intellectual, which I don't think Trump is. Hitler really believed in ideas. He believed in ideas about race and nation and history. He wrote a book about them, Mein Kampf. You can't imagine Trump really believing in any of those things. And one big difference is the fact that Trump was a winner in the American system and Hitler was a great loser in the system that he grew up in. So he had a great incentive to overturn it completely. Whereas Trump, you get the sense, wants the biggest prize on offer.
Very good distinction. If readers are considering this book versus some of the earlier biographies, how would you guide them between the Alan Bullock and the Joachim Fest and Ian Kershaw and then this latest by Volker Ullrich?
I think that Ullrich is perhaps the most accessible. He is a journalist mainly and not an academic historian, and he writes in a very accessible and absorbing style. It's definitely a good choice if it's the first major Hitler biography that you have read. Ullrich is a good place to start.
All right. And since you've read more than just the Ullrich, what did you learn in this book that you hadn't encountered elsewhere?
One thing that Ullrich brings out very well is the banality of Hitler when he was off stage and behind the scenes. So he takes you into his hotel suite in Munich or his retreat up in the mountains and shows you how he liked to sleep late. He didn't really like working very much. He liked to hang out in cafes. He preferred lowlife and bohemians to intellectuals or aristocrats, people who made him feel insecure. And many, many people who Ullrich quotes end up saying there was no way to know who Hitler was. He was so impenetrable, it was as though there was nothing there. And I think that's a sort of fascinating insight into him, that because there was nothing there, he was able to become this sort of blank screen onto which people projected the figure that they needed.
All right, very dark implications in that. The book, again, is Hitler, Ascent, 1889 to 1939 by Volker Ullrich, reviewed this week by Adam Kirsch. And as long as we have Adam here, just to talk a little bit about your own new book, The People and the Books.
Yes, I'd be glad to. It's a survey of classics of Jewish literature from the Bible down to the 20th century, and I take 18 classic texts, books like the Book of Esther, stories of Sholem Aleichem, the philosophy of Maimonides, and use them to show what Judaism historically meant and was about.
And how did you pick those 18 books? I imagine you have a lot to choose from.
Well, all of them are fairly well known, at least to specialists, but I think a lot of them are the kinds of books that you might recognize the title but wouldn't necessarily read. And so one thing I wanted to do in this book was to introduce them and open them up for a general reader who was interested.
Two very different books then.
Yes.
Adam, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Alexandra Alter joins us now to talk a little bit about what's going on in the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So this morning there was a surprise announcement. A great novelist has won the Nobel Prize in Literature.
It was a surprise announcement. It's so funny because every year it's a ritual for me. I get up early. I'm sitting at my computer listening to the Swedish Academy speak in Swedish to announce the winner of the Nobel.
Swedish.
Of course, I'm very fluent. And I wait for the name, and it's Herta Müller, it's Thomas Tranströmer, it's Svetlana Alexievich. And I go scrambling to Google to see who are these people. Typically, Alice Munro was an exception. So today, when they said Bob Dylan, I was incredibly surprised, even though he's been on the kind of long list of people's best guess of who was going to win the Nobel for a long time. It is really a break from tradition for them to pick not only someone so well known, but somebody who's a musician, who's a pop icon, who's not only producing what many people consider to be really literary lyrics, but is a very commercial musician and pop artist. He's had top albums in the top 10. And so it's fascinating to see the reactions. Of course, he has plenty of huge fans in the literary community, so a lot of people were pretty excited. I'm curious to see if anyone's going to be grumbling about the Nobel Committee overlooking poets, novelists, other people who write purely for, literature that's meant to be read. And that's one of the early debates that's come up. I mean, if you look at his lyrics, of course, he's published books of his lyrics. He's published a memoir. Many people argue they stand up on the page as poetry. But other people say, actually, this isn't a performance. You can't separate the music. You can't separate his vocals. You can't separate his presence, his band. All these things go into the experience of it. So it's interesting that they've really, I think, brought in the definition of literature with this prize. I imagine in private conversations in the publishing community, there's probably some disappointment. He does have a few books out with Simon & Schuster, including his memoir and his lyrics, and those will probably get a sales bump. But often when an author wins a Nobel, it's huge for the publishing industry. I mean, we've saw in the last couple of years with Svetlana Alexievich and with Patrick Modiano, some of their books hadn't been published in English. We had a wave of translations of their books. Those books sold tens of thousands of copies, if not more. So it's usually a big boost for the publishing industry. I imagine there are some people who are disappointed. I don't know how vocal will be about that.
They're going to reissue his Dada novel, Tarantula?
Tarantula, we'll see, maybe. But, talking to scholars who study his lyrics and his work, and there are many, including Harold Bloom, very serious literary scholars that have analyzed his work. One thing that I think is interesting about this is, by recognizing Bob Dylan, the Swedish Academy is sort of acknowledging this total collapse between the barriers between high art and low art, or popular culture and what people have considered high culture. I think that could be transformative, too. I mean, maybe we'll see more commercial authors getting the prize in coming years.
What was the reaction from the literary community?
So just hours after the prize was announced, right away on Thursday morning, there was a really mixed reaction that you could start to see building on Twitter. Some writers seemed to be genuinely enthusiastic. Salman Rushdie tweeted that song and poetry have always been closely linked, and Dylan is the brilliant inheritor of a bardic tradition. Great choice, #Nobel. So he was a supporter. Mary Carr was very enthusiastic. She said, congrats to Dylan on his Nobel, first American since Toni Morrison. Dang it, good for him. And then, of course, you had some dissenters. I mean, this is obviously a huge prize for writers, poets, authors, novelists, and they feel like this is taking away something from them. So some of the dissenters were Leila Lalami. She said, Bob Dylan, what? I've been disappointed plenty of times on Nobel announcement day, but this time I'm upset. And another dissenter was Rabah Alameddin. He said, Bob Dylan winning a Nobel in literature is like Mrs. Fields being awarded 3 Michelin stars. This is almost as silly as Winston Churchill. So,
well, they can get very upset when Philip Roth wins the Grammy.
Exactly. And, of course, the Paris Review chimed in with a funny note. Swedish Academy to writers, it's time to learn the guitar.
Okay. Take that, novelists.
Yes.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thank you.
Some writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheel's still in spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. Was the loser now will be later to win, for the times they are a-changing.
Very exciting to welcome to the podcast the poet Billy Collins, who has a new collection out, The Rain in Portugal. Welcome, Billy.
Thank you for having me.
And our poetry editor, Greg Coles.
Hi, Pamela. Hi, Billy.
Greg.
Hi, Greg.
All right. Tell us about this, the new book that you have, The Rain in Portugal.
Well, it's my new book. It was born just a day or two ago, so it's a Libra. I don't know if I get along with Libras, but we'll see. Having a book out is a thrill, even though it's, I guess, my 11th or 12th, but that thrill doesn't wear off. Although not having a book out, but having a book in the works is also probably even more pleasurable. Someone said that every writer has the same favorite word, and that word is forthcoming, because all is possible. It's just more of me. I don't know. As usual, I don't write books. I write poems. Mm-hmm. And then they're raked together into a pile when I have enough. So I've never written a thematic book, except the themes are, the themes are me, or my persona anyway, and mortality. And in here, there are poems about art. It's a poem about flying around and playing with Shakespeare. Poems that take place in Greece and Ireland and Mexico. So there's a number.
Portugal, certainly.
Portugal gets in there slightly.
Let's start with the title. It's almost a dad joke about poetry, and the idea that it should rhyme, because the famous phrase, of course, from My Fair Lady is "the rain in Spain." So by replacing that with "the rain in Portugal," you are subverting our expectations, announcing that you're going to refuse the rhyme.
Subverting, I am, yes. Certainly carries that implication, or admission, really, that I'm not much of a rhyming poet. And, Portugal is a hard word to find a rhyme for. I imagine some people could do it, but nothing comes to mind. And it's being contiguous to Spain and sharing the Iberian Peninsula, it seemed like an interesting play on words.
Yeah, and also an interesting play on poetry. Because it's contiguous, you're making a play of the close rhyme. It's geographically close. I mean, if you were going for the real close rhyme the way that poets do, you might do the rain in Des Moines or the rain in Britain or something like that. But
it's almost there.
Exactly. You come close to the rhyme and then stop.
Yeah. It's like a soft drink called 6 Up. 3 Up wouldn't be good, but 6 Up is good. It's a bit of an admission, but that I'm not a formal poet. And not really a manifesto, but maybe a trigger warning that you're not going to find. If you're looking for end rhyme, you're not going to find too many here.
Will you read that poem that the title comes from? It's printed in full on the back of the book.
Sure. Here it is. On rhyme. It's possible that a stitch in time might save as many as 12 or as few as 3, and I have no trouble remembering that September has 30 days. So do June, November, and April. I like a cat wearing a chapeau or a trilby, little Jack Horner sitting on a sofa, old men who are not from Nantucket, and how life can seem almost unreal when you are gently rowing a boat down a stream. That's why, instead of recalling today that it pours mostly in Spain, I'm going to picture the rain in Portugal, how it falls on the hillside vineyards, on the surface of the deep harbors where the fishing boats are swaying, and in the narrow alleys of the cities where 3 boys in T-shirts are kicking a soccer ball in the rain, ignoring the window cries of their mothers.
I'm going to stand in for the non-poetic listener right now and ask the obvious question, what's wrong with rhyme?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with rhyme. It's just that I can't do it. No, I've taught English literature for 300 years, and regular meter and rhyme were synonymous with poetry. That's what poetry was. Mm-hmm. The way to understand not the loss of rhyme, but the moment when rhyme became optional, and that's basically what happened in this century, but starting with Whitman. But very little happens between Whitman and we get to the 20th century. Good poets didn't just take a scissors and scissor off all the rhyme words on the right side of the poem and throw them in the trash. What happened in the best poems is that the little sentinel rhymes standing there at the ends of lines and doing their rhyme job abandoned their positions at the ends of lines and invaded the body of the poem.
So you started getting the interior rhymes, the internal rhymes.
So if in your glossary it says internal rhymes, so that the whole poem becomes more of an organic sound system. And it might not sound like it when I read that poem, but I write with my ear, and I also write with whatever sense of timing I have. And most of my revisions are really adjustments in sound, or if it's not rhyme, at least it comes under the heading of assonance, making it sound better.
When you say it started with Whitman, but then there was a long period, how did it start up again in the 20th century, and with whom?
Well, with the modernists. I mean, the French poets of the late 19th century practiced non-rhyming poetry, but basically it was that whole movement of high modernism that as we call it now, Ezra Pound and Eliot and Wallace Stevens a little later. It was basically this reaction to the fact of the First World War, the expansion of reading, emergence of technology, the whole kind of movement from the comfort of Victorian, late Victorian, and then Edwardian mannered poetry into a very disjunctive world that was unsteadied by these global events, and that kind of, at least potentially sing-songy, comforting rhythm was not right for the times.
The way that I read that poem on rhyme that you just read is not so much an argument against rhyme itself, but exactly that kind of comforting sing-songiness, the cliche or the laziness that rhyme can bring about, the whole kind of moon, June, love, dove, tyranny, that kind of thing.
Well, you notice the examples I'm using are nursery rhymes and mnemonics, like how many days in the month and that kind of thing. And then I guess if there's some camera work involved in the poem, we start with this list of this guy who prefers not rhyming, and he's going to abandon, and reject all these comforting mnemonic rhymes. And then, but the camera work is kind of focusing in then on the rain in Portugal, where we, see now we have a harbor with fishing boats, we have hillsides, and then finally we go into a city and we keep zooming. And there are 3 boys there in T-shirts, and there's the ball. So I'm trying to, in a lot of these poems, I try to take the reader on a kind of it starts sort of with something general, then goes into a very focused little world, like a little, kind of like walking into a hologram, where it's not quite real, but you can see it anyway.
There's a portrait, a close-up of a portrait on the cover of the book.
Yeah.
Who is it?
Oddly enough, I've chosen all the covers for my book, all the cover art.
You?
Yeah, I'm surprised the art department at Random House doesn't just come after me with a cleaver and say, stick to your knitting, boy. Like going into the kitchen and telling the chef what to do. But I'm pretty good at it, actually, even though it's desperate. So I came across it's a drawing by a late 18th century French painter, artist called Charles Antoine Coypel. I've never heard of him, and I haven't really done too much research. I just love the woman. It's a close up. She just has this look of, I don't know, vexation, consternation, fear. You can't, she's beautifully rendered and beautiful herself. And then that little furrow in the brow just is so expressive. I didn't know this either until later, of course. She's the wife of a character in the Bible called Potiphar, Phar. And she's not a nice person, as it turns out. She's famous in the Bible for seducing one of her husband's friends, or trying to. He rejects her, and in revenge, she accuses him of rape. So she's not a nice lady.
So once you knew that backstory, did you think, exactly what I want on the cover? Or did you think, that doesn't quite
I was saying, I'll never tell anybody.
But you just have.
But here I am. So I thought I'd keep it to myself. I was too late to take it back, actually. But I figured it's a rather obscure biblical character, and if I didn't mention it, everything would be cool.
Now it's not.
So,
all right, to make up for it, would you read us another poem?
Sure.
I like the one about Uncle John's farm. I should say the book's not all comedy. There are a number of poems that can be slotted into the kind of straightforward narrative lyric, and this is one of them.
The one about Uncle John's farm sounds like a nursery rhyme with a cow and a horse and all that. This is a moment, one of the functions of poetry is just to work against the forces of amnesia by just locking in a moment that you just do not want to forget, or that you recall in a Wordsworthian sense and want to freeze in or catch in amber, just so it doesn't go away. Mm-hmm. And this was a moment that's stuck with me when I was a teenager, living in Queens, New York, but my mother's Canadian, and almost every summer we would spend the summer in northern Ontario around this farm. And the title is 16 years old, I helped bring in the hay on my Uncle John's farm with 2 French-Canadian workers. None of us expected the massing thunderheads to swing open their doors so suddenly that we would have to drop our rakes and run across the field to a shelter and stand there side by side under its tin roof, looking out through a shiny curtain of rain. We had never spent any time together except for the haying, raking it into piles and pitchforking it up into an old truck. But now there was nothing to do but watch and listen to the downpour, and nothing to say either. After the cigarettes had been offered around and lit one by one with the flame of a single match. So there's a sort of, they were old. I mean, I was 16. When you're 16, someone, like 28 is kind of old. And I don't know how old these guys were, but they were men. I was a boy. And they didn't speak much English. And I was the kid, and I was probably more in the way than anything else, but I was trying to be a good worker. So there was this kind of male bonding on my part, or kind of, thrust into this world of way up in Canada with these French-Canadian workers. And even though they were, Quebec, but they were in Ontario working. And sort of with this respect for them and appreciating the silence, and like having a cigarette with them would be like a real cool thing to do.
Yeah. What made you think of that, remember that incident, and want to write about it now?
I don't know. Recently I went back up to Canada and visited all those sites there, and I still have a lot of relatives up there. I think I wrote the poem before that, but I don't know. My mother is a big theme in these poems, and my father comes into it too, but she was a very strong influence and lived to be 97, not as old as Donald Hall, 200 years old. I'm kind of proud of being half Canadian. That's my boast for ethnicity. And my mind kind of swings back to those days. It's where I first heard jazz when I was also that same summer, and I first heard rock and roll right around that time. So those summers were very kind of crucial in my development.
So something in that poem just makes me think very strongly of Philip Levine with the physical labor and the coming of age and the kind of camaraderie. And he, of course, had the Detroit, Canada connection.
Yeah. This is probably my only one about physical labor. That's the far as I got there. Then I picked up the pen, like Seamus, and said, I'll dig with it instead of the shovel.
We'll end on that note with that final poem, although there are many others in the collection. The name of the book, again, is The Rain in Portugal. Billy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Instability was a constant in the childhood of the writer Io Tillett Wright. His new memoir about his unconventional coming of age is called Darling Days. Io Tillett Wright is also an LGBT activist and the host of MTV's Suspect, and he joins me now. Io, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So your new book is a memoir and starts off in the East Village in the 1980s and 90s where you grew up. What was it like back then? Very different from today.
Oh, it was a different world. It was a wild jungle of everyone that had been kicked out of everywhere else for being too weird or too unique or too unhinged. They all came to New York and they all somehow landed seemingly on my block. And now it's just been cleaned up and whitewashed. Yeah, I mean, it was every performance artist. It was where all the poor artists went and where all the drug addicts also congregated. Weirdly, those two things seem to always go together. So I grew up in just a forest of creatures that most people will never see in their lifetime, you know.
How did your parents end up there?
My dad is a native New Yorker, but he grew up on the Upper East Side, and I think he was drawn to people who thought outside of the box, and it was like the no wave movement was happening, and punk was like in its full effect, and he was drawn to avant-garde filmmaking and avant-garde culture in general. So for him, it was more of a conscious choice around art and thinking and thought, whereas my mom, she moved to New York from Kansas when she was like 17. She did a striptease contest and used her money to get a drive-away car and ran away. And she fell in love with a guy named Billy Balls, who had an act called Billy Balls Piano. And he took her downtown and he showed her the East Village, which at that point was, I guess it was 1977, and it was overrun with Vietnam vets coming home from the war who were caught up between speed and heroin, and St. Mark's Place was just like a teeming cesspool at that point, and it became home to her, and she stayed.
You chose to begin your memoir with a letter to your mother. Why did you do that?
When I first found out that I was going to be writing a book or that someone was actually wanted to publish it, I called both of my parents and I said, listen, I'm not going to do this if this isn't something that you guys are on board with, because I don't want to abuse our relationship and it's going to air all of our dirty laundry. Are you guys with it? And my dad said, yes, 100%, I'm totally behind you. I don't care what the world thinks of me. I never have. And my mom said, I'm on your team, kid. They're both wildly supportive. As I was writing it, I worked quite closely with my father on the language and sentence structure and things like that. But my mom hadn't read the manuscript until I was finished, and I had this sense of dread hanging over me as I was working through it, that the book covers some quite traumatic stuff and some very dark moments in our history, and a lot of moments that I think she doesn't remember because she was blacked out. My mom is like fiercely protective of me, but also somewhat unhinged, and I knew that the idea that she would hurt me is something that is beyond her capacity to reconcile with herself, and I knew that reading a book that was written first person present, having to walk through all of these experiences from the perspective of how much pain these things caused in me was going to devastate her, and I had moved to LA and she still lives in New York, and I wanted to figure out how to communicate to her where I was coming from with this and why I felt it was important to write this book, because for me it's not about the banner headlines of neglect or abuse or drugs or whatever, transgender stuff. The book is really a love story between me and my mom and the capacity of human beings to forgive and have understanding and redefine the roles that they're supposed to play for each other. And then I realized as I wrote the letter and I was crying and feeling into it, and the more people I read it to, the more I realized, this has to be what the reader experiences first, so it sets the tone so that this book doesn't become an indictment of a parent, because that's the last thing that I want.
Would you read for us the beginning of that letter to your mother?
Sure, happily. Dear Ma, since my first conscious moments, you have been a gladiator to me, the fiercest example of a woman's power I could ever know. We are some kind of twins, able to see each other in a room of closed eyes, able to hear each other in a world of silence, despite the trauma layered into our story. You are the priestess at the head of my tiny tribe of one. Since I learned to use a phone, and to this day, when our family wants to reach you, they do it through me. I am the whisperer, the only one who can ever locate you in the jungle of New York, because you will always call me back. When no one could find you to break the news, it fell to me to tell you that your mother had died. The noise that came from you then was an animal pain. The realization that I would also one day lose you was so unbearable that I had to hang up. For years, we were best friends. long before the fights and the screaming and the law got involved, which is why I feel like I need to say a few things to you before you read this collection of stories intended to capture my life.
So I'm sure that this raises many questions for listeners who have not read the book. Can you recount, if you would, a typical day growing up in your house with your mother, Mona?
Well, there was pre-7 and post-7 is kind of how I see it. Something happened. I won't get into it, but something ruptured in my mother's life when I was about 7, and it sent her spiraling backwards. And she kind of stopped paying attention to food. We were forced to leave our apartment, so I would say, let's say a typical day, age 9, would be wake up in an apartment which is in a building that is under construction because we lived in low-income housing. So often we would wake up and all of the gas would be off or the lights would be off in the whole building or somebody would be drilling through the wall trying to knock it down. It would be probably about 15 minutes before I was supposed to be at school. We would scream at each other for some unknown reason. She'd be angry about God only knows what. And then we would traipse across town. We'd walk from East 3rd Street or East 4th Street across to PS3, which is on Hudson between Christopher and Grove. And the West Village, first thing in the morning, is a fun forest of wildlife. That would be 1994. Then I would have gone to school for a day, living as a boy, which at that age is kind of just something that people are curious about but aren't necessarily offended by. But there was no trans discussion at that point. It was just something people were a little bit bewildered by. And then I would have left school probably by myself and gone to any number of dance classes and potentially auditions. And then I probably would have gone and performed in some church basement play of some kind or gone to several auditions. And then I wasn't allowed to go home while the sun was out. That was the rule, and I didn't have keys to the apartment, so we would have stayed out until my mom was ready to go home, which probably would have been, 12:30 or 1 o'clock at night, and depending on whether or not she'd had some wine or some other fixins, it would have been an eventful night or not, and we would have gone home. And
what did you eat?
I ate a lot of bagels. If there was some money around, I would go and get like a cup of rice and beans from the deli around the corner. I stole a lot of food when I was a kid, but I was really hungry a lot. My mom is like vehement about her dieting, and she's fiercely vegetarian, and so she has very strict ideas about what's healthy and what's not. So she kind of just put me on her diet, which was she'd have carrot juice in the morning or in the afternoon, and I guess some vegetables in the afternoon, but I didn't really partake in that very much. There wasn't just a lot of food around when I was a kid.
When you were growing up, did you have a sense of like, this is not a typical family situation?
My mom was a hoarder as well, so the apartment was filled with old moldings and furniture that she'd found in dumpsters and stuff. So the apartment, in addition to often not having any electricity, was also, you couldn't move in the apartment. So our place wasn't somewhere where kids would ever come over to hang out with us. So I spent most of my time alone without any kind of reference point for what other people my age were growing up in. In the book, around age 9, I go to this kid's house in New Jersey, and it describes being there with my socks with holes in them and having to explain to his mom that I don't have any pajamas to sleep in. And it was one of the first moments that I remember being confronted by the reality of what it would be like to live a safe, consistent, warm, cozy life as a child. And I think around age 9 is when I started to separate. There's like a fierce loyalty that happens between, I think, parents and children until children develop their own sense of identity and their own trains of thought. And I didn't realize that there was any other way besides my mom's way, I think, until I was about 9. And then things started to happen between 9 and 11 where I thought, oh, this is really not good. This is really not normal. And I started to get angry, and we would fight more and more viciously. And so by the time I was 12 and I went to a middle school, I went to Baruch, which is on between 20th and 21st, between 1st and 2nd. They were very strict, and they had gender-segregated locker rooms. And if you showed up late, you had to go to detention and all of this. And when they tried to send me down into the locker rooms to change my clothes for gym class, I had a panic attack, and that eventually led to the guidance counselor asking me what my home life was like, which is a chapter in the book as well. It's just this like big moment of I think anyone can relate to the moment where you are truly aware that you are separating from the place that you come from and becoming your own human. And unfortunately for me, it became a matter of choosing between this person who was my greatest protector and my greatest antagonist, who I was fiercely loyal to, but who, if I stayed with, there was a very good chance that I would end up sick or not well.
Part of your establishing your own independent identity was, of course, related to gender. Do you remember the moment when you started to identify as a boy?
I've had to try to pinpoint this as if there was a light switch that went off one day when I was just like, oh, I'm a boy. But the truth of the matter is I scanned 2,500 of my mom's photographs of every second of my existence from about her pregnancy till about 15. I realized that I had been expressing it since the second I could stand up and the second I could choose my own clothes. It was just a matter of, at around age 6, kids start to segregate themselves into groups based on what gender means that you have to do. And I had always played sports and climbed stuff and kicked things down and like done all the quote-unquote boyish stuff, and it didn't matter. But then at around age 6, they wouldn't let me play. And then it was like, oh, you have to choose one now. And then I guess I made a choice at that point. But that wasn't because I suddenly felt that way. I had always felt that way. But then at 14, when puberty hit and crushes were starting to happen, I felt like I wanted to try being a girl because I didn't know what that was like. I had been taken away from my mom and shipped to live with my dad in Germany, and I thought, oh, maybe the way to have a normal life is to just fit in, not have a secret that you're hiding from people all the time. And so I tried to live as a girl for a while. And it took me until 3 years ago at 28 to figure out that actually I think I had it right when I was a kid. And I might have, quote-unquote, switched back because of social pressures. But, this is why I'm afraid with this book of ever becoming a poster child for anything and becoming a poster child for the trans narrative, because I really don't actually fit into what I've heard from people is the typical trans narrative of hating your body, and people don't typically switch back and forth. Mm-hmm. There is no typical when it comes to something as personal as gender. So I'm loath to become a poster child for any of that,
What did your mother say after reading the book?
It's been tough. I brought the manuscript to her by hand because she's not an internet person, thank God, and I read the letter to her aloud in my old bedroom because she still is down there, and she cried. And then she took the manuscript and sat in a bookstore and read the whole thing in one day, back-to-back in 12 hours because she's loyal like that. And she called me, and I was trembling when I saw the phone call coming in, and she said, "My butt, you wrote a beautiful thing. You're such a good writer." And I was like, "Oh my God, when's the other shoe gonna drop?" That was it. And then she called me back the next day and said, "But one more thing. I was never an addict or an alcoholic." And I thought, "Oh God, this is not a conversation that I can have with you. You got to have this conversation with somebody else." And gradually, over the course of the last year, we've gone through the full arc of every emotion possible. She's never bailed on me. She's never said, "I don't want you to publish this," but she was very afraid that people would perceive her as a monster. Her attitude was, "I can't believe that this stuff happened, and I can't believe that you have forgiven me and still talk to me and still take care of me and are still with me through this, and I don't know how I'm going to be able to leave the house because people are going to judge me." And I said, Mom, I think that people experience a great love between us when reading this book, and that's not really how they're going to take it. But she didn't see that until 2 weeks ago when she came to my reading. I had my reading that kicked off my book tour at the Strand on September 27th, and that she wanted to come, and I didn't want her. I was afraid. I wanted to protect her, and I said, "I don't know if you should be there." But she insisted, and I said, "All right, well, then show up if you want to." And she sat in the back. And I did the reading, and then I had a really amazing Q&A session with all of these people who showed up. And then there was a line of kids and just people who came to the table saying things about how just hearing my story made them feel like they were less alone in their, I guess, weirdness or outside otherness on this planet. She called me the day after. She said, "I didn't realize how people experience your story, and seeing it in person and seeing how it makes people feel less alone, I realize that it's not about me and it's not about indicting me, and they don't take it that way. they take it as a beautiful thing, and now I really see the power of this, and I think it's really a beautiful thing.
Well, let's end there on a beautiful thing.
Yeah, on a positive note.
Io, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Pamela.
The book again is Darling Days by Io Tillett Wright, and his book is reviewed this week in the book review by Alicia Abbott. John Williams and Greg Coles join us now to talk about what we and other people are reading. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
Let's talk about the other people first.
Most of the action this week on the bestseller list is on the hardcover fiction side of things.
There's a crazy number of new books.
There are a crazy number of new books. Starting down at number 16, W.E.B. Griffin and his son, William E. Butterworth IV, have a book, Broken Trust. At number 15, Billy Collins, former poet laureate. His new collection, The Rain in Portugal, hits the list at number 15. Then at number 10, Ellen Hilderbrand, Winter Storms. Number 7, Debbie McComber has a new one, 12 Days of Christmas. At number 6, Maria Semple, also a recent podcast guest, is on the list with Today Will Be Different. At number 2, Tana French's latest, The Trespasser. And at number 1, a new book by Nicholas Sparks, 2 by 2.
All right. And then we have some two very politically different points of view new on the nonfiction list.
Yeah, a very political book at number 13, Edward Klein's Guilty as Sin, which is his latest argument against Hillary Clinton. And then at number 12, a book that is pretty wide-ranging, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice, an anthology called My Own Words. And this really takes you through like 70 years of her writing, going back all the way to when she was like 13 years old and won an essay writing contest. And that's in there, or like a student newspaper editorial that she wrote, stemming all the way through much of her Supreme Court writing.
All right. John, are you reading the notorious RBG, or are you reading about sex as usual?
I'm not only reading about sex as usual, I'm reading about sex and Freud.
Okay.
So it's a real twofer. The first thing I've been reading this week is Emily Witt's new book, Future Sex.
Our listeners can't see this, but John has strategically removed the jacket cover from this book so that
I've been reading it in part on the subway, and the cover is quite suggestive. And it's good. She's a very smart writer. She writes for N+1 and other places, and this is her kind of tour through 21st century female sexuality, both her own when she turned 30 and was still single. She was kind of curious about why that was, and then also just the way that the culture refracts it. So there are chapters about the porn industry and, chat things online, the way people meet each other. There's an orgasmic meditation group in California that she attends. And it feels a little bit like a writer who decided to write about a subject. And so it doesn't feel quite organic in a way, but I'm only halfway through, and I think that it's going to kind of build to some more, personal insights as she goes along about what she's learned.
It's all about the personal insights.
And it is all about
it's not about
as the
sex.
cover attests.
Right.
And I've also been reading a short biography by Peter Kramer, a writer I had mentioned earlier this year on the podcast, called Freud, Inventor of the Modern Mind. There's a quote from a critic that says that he reconciles the two Freuds, the inventor of the modern mind and the false saint, and that is a considerable achievement. Mostly I'm through the false saint part. I mean, it's amazing how somewhat quackish and unscientific most of his early work was, but I think that Kramer's going to make the case that concepts that he introduced, like transference and repression, have a kind of wider, almost literary value that's ongoing and that we still use in our culture and in our personal lives. But really it has my favorite sentence I've read this week, which is in parentheses. Some of my favorite sentences are often in parentheses. And this one says, "Swimming, Freud favors the breaststroke to keep his beard dry." So, Greg, what are you reading this week?
Well, as of this morning, I have picked up and started rereading Bob Dylan's Chronicles, Volume 1, which is the memoir that he came out with several years ago. I got great attention. It was surprising for Bob Dylan, very kind of straightforward, just going to retrace the early part of my life and the early part of my career.
Not the long-awaited follow-up to Tarantula, his 1971 novel.
Exactly. I did tweet out this morning a line from the very ending of Chronicles where Bob Dylan says, "There were other Minnesotans, too, that I felt akin to." And then he goes on to say, Sinclair Lewis had won the Nobel Prize for Literature, the first American to do so. So now Bob Dylan, the last American, the most recent American to do so. I've also started reading a book that got some attention earlier this year by a Flemish writer named Stefan Hertmans. It's a novel called War and Turpentine. It really resonates with me for a very personal reason. Hertmans' grandfather was an aspiring and very ambitious painter, and my great-grandfather was an ambitious, aspiring sculptor. He made his career doing that. There are real parallels so far in their approach to art, their belief, their kind of aesthetics. I'm really engaging with Hertmans' grandfather as a character. It's not so clear to me in the early going why this book is called a novel instead of a family history or a memoir.
It sort of blends, right? Nonfiction and fiction, the way that like Sebald does.
Yeah, but Sebald. I've also been thinking very much of Michael Ondaatje's early work, like Running in the Family, his memoir that just veers clearly into fictional territory as well. I think this is called a novel because it allowed Hertmans to imagine his way into his grandfather's life in a way that more straightforward nonfiction would not have let him do.
That's been near the top of my pile for a while, too. Pamela, you have a book open in front of you. What is that?
I do, because I want to read a little bit from it. This is a book, not a new book, 1990, from Muriel Spark. And I picked it up in London where the bookstore, one of the stores I went to, had a standing display of 20 of her books, which you don't often come across. The book has a really interesting construct. It starts off, it's called Symposium. It's centered around a dinner party. And you start off at the dinner party, and then it jumps back in time where you visit the various guests of that dinner party and see how they all connect in a number of surprising ways, something you would never have been able to tell from the initial interactions at the dinner party. And I'm about halfway through, so I expect we'll come back to the party. But the part I want to read is from before the party, where the hosts, a couple, not married but longtime companions, are discussing and gossiping about the various guests they plan to invite to the dinner party. There's just this little snippet of conversation that I think captures Muriel Spark's humor. It was time for drinks. Their conversation became rather contrapuntal. He lamented the fact that he hadn't been near his studio the whole afternoon. "It's Sunday," she said, as if that were a factor of any sort. He was vaguely looking at the mantelpiece. "I adore the Salvation Army," he said, with what relevance nobody will ever know. "Nivea cream," Chris said presently, as she sipped her vodka and tonic, "is my Proust's Madeleine. The only reason I use it. Total recall." "Do you know," mused Hurley, "those champagne growers, the Ferrandi family, one of the cousins was killed by his wife with a blow on the head from a bottle of his own brand of champagne. The French make their bottles very heavy, especially champagne." "Helen, Susie, and Brian have accepted," said Chris. "I wonder how long that marriage will last." I just love
She's
that.
great.
She is great. I read The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie earlier this year.
A couple of years ago, I went on a kick where I read 4 or 5 of her books in like a month, but I didn't get to that one. I'm going to add that to the list.
Yeah,
Did you read
It's really
Memento
funny.
Mori? That's my other
Yes,
favorite.
that's great. Yeah.
Which that one has, again, also this amazing construction where just a bunch of older people get a phone call that says something to the effect of, "You're going to die."
That's the gist.
All right. On that cheery note, thanks, John. Thanks,
Pamela.
Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.